Hey beer geeks, and welcome to a video that I've wanted to make for a really long time. This is the Craft Beer Channel crash course in the wonderful world of hops. It's going to be a whirlwind tour around the world as we explore the incredible aromas, flavours and textures that we can get from these beautiful flowers when brewers add them at the right time, the right temperatures and in the right order. This is hops.
I like to be educated, but I'm so frustrated. Hello to my loneliness. I guess that ignorance is bliss. Take me back to before I knew. Rewind, take it out of cue. Innocence can be a young man's game. Signed up for the hall of shame. I wish I knew.
If you got into beer in the last 20 years, it's pretty likely that it was hops that hooked you. They're responsible for much of the aroma in beer, not just in modern styles like the New England IPA, but in more traditional ones, from Czech lagers to British bitters. Hop plants grow in the temperate latitudes of the northern and southern hemispheres, flowering in late summer and early autumn. It's the flowers that we use in brewing, and while at harvest time we sometimes throw flowers fresh from the vine into our beer, they're usually picked, dried and even processed into pellets. The idea is to preserve and even intensify the hop's essential oils and acids, which impart aroma, flavour and bitterness into the beer. There are 4 main hop growing regions in the world: the Pacific Northwest of America, the UK, Central Europe and New Zealand and Southeast Australia, and each of them have their own customs, techniques, terroir and unique varieties that mean hops can go from smelling of heady spice and floral honey to overripe mango and marijuana. Over the next 2 videos we're going to take a hop rubbing tour of the world, learning what to expect from each region and their most famous varieties, as well as a little bit about how hops ended up being in beer and how modern brewers have used this remarkable flower to create the incredible variety we see in craft brewing today.
So believe it or not, hops are actually kind of the last ingredient that we started adding to our beers, unless we count yeast where we were adding it but not really knowing what it was or what it does right up until the 19th century. And hops, the first record we have of hops being used in beer is in 822, so about 1,200 years ago, when Abbot Adelhard of a Benedictine monastery in France near Amiens writes about using these hops in the brews that the monastery was making. And monasteries were really the hotbed, the real engines of brewing back then, doing all of the innovation and indeed most of the brewing for themselves, for poor people and for sale. Previous to that, hops would have had lots of uses, including dyes for many of the clothes that the monks would also have been producing. So at some point they realised that adding it to the beer was having a good effect too. And that good effect was that it was preserving the beer. Back then, before we knew what yeast was, before we knew that cleanliness really mattered, we were getting a lot of infected beers. And by infected beers, I mean Brettanomyces infections or other wild yeast infections that could turn the beer kind of funky, a little bit cidery, and indeed bacterial infections such as things like Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, and Acetobacter, these things that make the beer really sour. And when you want that, that's great, but most of the time you don't. You wanted as clean a beer as you could possibly produce. And we learned, the monasteries in particular learned, that adding hops would reduce or prevent or delay the onset of these souring bacteria. So we started to add them to protect our beer from going sour and didn't really mind about the flavour. In fact, about 300 years later, an abbess Hildegard, writes about how this is a wonderful thing. It stops certain putrefactions is the word that she uses, but that she's not really a hop fan. She says that the flavour of hops can make man's soul sad, and I think we've all had that kind of hangover. Nonetheless, hops became really popular. It meant less wastage, less chucking away of really sour beer, and it also added to the structure, the flavour of these beers when done right. So you didn't want too much bitterness in these beers. A lot of them were very dry, thanks to things like Brettanomyces and these things, but they did add a nice bitterness to these drinks. And so brewers started A, harvesting them and looking after them, and B, storing them, which also they found would reduce the bitterness without necessarily affecting the sort of the antiseptic quality that they had. So for the first couple of hundred years, hops had a really practical function and not really an aroma or a flavour one outside of trying to embrace that bitterness within the recipes. Now that switch from really focusing on the bitterness and the antiseptic quality of hops and over into the aroma and the flavour takes hundreds and hundreds of years to happen. And in fact, arguably, it might not even have happened, that full-on sort of volume switch, until the 1990s or even the 2000s. But we know by the 19th century, brewers were getting much more picky about the hops that they were using, and indeed the malts and the yeast that they were using. And we know that the hopping rates were really increasing as well as brewers started to store their beer for longer and longer. Maybe for the British brewers to send to India, or the British porter brewers who were having to age their beers for longer to round out the smoky flavours from the cheap malt that they were using. You can see the history of porter and IPAs, I believe, up on this side. But we were actually going to start in Europe, I guess to some extent, hundreds of years before that switch with the IPAs and porters started to happen. And in central continental Europe, basically known as Bavaria and Bohemia. Hey Big Geeks, this is just a quick paid advertisement from BetterHelp. If you're a long-time subscriber to our channel or our podcast, you'll know how open Brad and I are about our mental health. With a passion like ours, it's super important to know that you're drinking for the right reasons, for the flavours, for the experiences, for the social cohesion, and for the relaxation that it can bring. And it's so easy for drinking to go from a joyful and positive pastime to something that actually starts to bring you down and harms your mental and physical well-being. Opening up is never easy, and we all have different ways we prefer to do it. That's why we like the flexibility of BetterHelp. After connecting you with a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice, BetterHelp allows you to conduct your session by phone, video call, or even messaging, however you feel most comfortable. Better yet, they often help you make that connection with your new therapist within 48 hours. It's the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist, and you can use our link, betterhelp.com/craftbeerchannel. Now back to the video. Love and beer. So the world of beer as we know it, as most people know it, which is sort of the proliferation of pale Bavarian or Bohemian style lagers, starts in that very region, and with breweries like Spaten. Now owned by AB InBev, sadly, a bit of a mothball brand, but it is one of the most important breweries in the history of beer, and therefore indeed one of the most important companies in the world. And there's loads of information in my new book, a whole story about what Spaten has done for the world, coming at you in November. But the hops that these guys were using, that's the topic of this video, would have likely been stuff grown in Bavaria. So what I've got here for our first rubbing is Hallertau Mittelfrüh, an absolute classic German style hop, and exactly the kind of aromas that you'd expect to get in, say, a German Pilsner. So this variety, grown in Bavaria, one of the biggest hop growing regions of the world, and I just got a massive hit of sort of slightly dry grass there. You can see here the pellets are really, really firm. That sort of points to the fact that there's going to be a little bit less kind of hop oil content to them. They're a bit harder to squidge down. When we get to the hops on the right hand side of this table, that's going to be a very different story. But these are the ones that give Hopfenweissens, or sorry, Weissbiers, German Pilsners, Dunkels, Doppelbocks, the kind of fresh hay, or dry hay rather, fresh grass, kind of honey, spice, not very earthy, like really green kind of aromas, green and fresh, that converge onto sort of lemon rind and even lemon juice with really juicy varieties. And that's down to the oils, the essential oils. So there's volatile oils that sort of will either boil off in the boil or pop out of the can or bottle when you open it. Yeah, and that smells really strongly like a very sweet grass, like a meadow, some kind of meadow that you'd frolic through. A really lovely pastoral kind of aroma to it. Not really tropical or anything like that we expect in lots of modern beers. There's lots of different varieties of Hallertau. There's Hallertau Blanc, a more modern variety that we think has some kind of white wine kind of character as well. And other hops, other similar hops, things like Tettnanger. So there we go, Hallertau, honeyed, sweet, floral kinds of aromas. Perfect for these kind of beers where it really complements that kind of biscuity, sweet Pilsner base, or really great with big, bold Hefeweizens and just sitting in the background, adding bitterness and, of course, the antiseptic qualities. Now, the other sort of big lager hop that was around back then and was part of the origin of Pilsner Urquell, which was the first ever Pilsner brewed, is Saaz. So this comes from the Czech Republic, from the Zatech region of the Czech Republic. And this is one of my favourite, absolute favourite hops. So Saaz, again, it's going to have some of the character that you'd get in Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Tettnanger, but I think that when it's used in really big quantities, it can start to go really kind of soft, juicy red fruits. So things like strawberries and raspberries I get off of quite heavily hopped and really fresh Bohemian lagers. But then again, also fresh grass, freshly cut grass, and meadows, and sometimes a little bit of earthiness to it as well. These hops have a protected designation of origin. They can only be grown in that part. Yeah, and they smell pretty similar. A little bit kind of juicier, a little bit kind of strawberry juice kind of vibe to it. It's softer, it's fleshier almost. So less of that sharp citric and more of that kind of British fruit kind of character. That transports me down to the cellars of Budvar, where we made a great film 2 years ago, exploring their hop cellar, where it just smells of that as soon as you go with it through, but also the lager cellar, when you pour those beers super fresh off the tank. And you get that watery, juicy, almost melon kind of aroma off of it. So that's the kind of flavour you could expect if you see a beer hopped with Sars, or indeed some of the more modern varieties that are coming out of the Czech Republic, things like Most, which is Czech for bridge because they crossed it with a British variety, where they're trying to amp up the aromas to compete with the modern stuff that we'll talk about later. And you'll see that in the UK, the Czech Republic, and Germany. So I've got a modern variety here to have a little sniff of as well. So this is Mandarina Bavaria, also grown in Bavaria, obviously. And the clue to the aromas we're going to get from this is mandarina, mandarin. So we're starting to talk about more tropical, more juicy, more citric kind of fruits. Much smaller pellet. Whew. So this one, I got a little hint of kind of oniony dankness coming off that. So we know it's going to be a modern, really oily hop. That's a particular compound that is great in small quantities in hops. It adds a real kind of, I guess, naughtiness and intrigue to a beer if it's in small quantities. Yeah, really soft orange juice. No kind of peel really to it. It is like when you've peeled when you're peeling the skin off and you're breaking those segments and you're getting little sprays of orange. Now the aroma on this is obviously very, very different. The pellets look different. They're much paler. They're much oilier. But another really big difference that we have to talk about and will throughout all of this is the fact that this has a much higher, I guess, potency for bitterness. So look at Hallertau Mittelfrüh. This has an alpha of 2.7, and alpha acids are the things that are isomerized in the boil, and basically that bitterness is sort of baked into the beer when you boil it. So this is 2.7%. This one is way up at 9.8. So you basically have to add 4 times as many of these hops to get the same bitterness into the beer as you would these. And we will, when we get to the American hops, start to talk about what that really means in terms of the agronomy, in terms of the use in the brewery, and in terms of the flavours and aromas that we're going to be able to get out of these hops. So that is continental Europe in a nutshell. What you get is you get fresh grass and hay, you get soft spiciness and smoothness and honey kind of character, and you also get lovely floral and verging on citrus or red berry kind of fruitness. So these are soft, subtle, smooth hops that work really, really well in softer, more subtle, smooth kind of beers. Things like Czech Pilsners, things like German Pilsners, and particularly Helles, where Hallertau is the perfect match. And as well as adding bitterness and antiseptic quality and a little bit of depth to beers that don't really need hopping, things like Hopfenweissens. And you'll see in these areas, in fact all over the world, you'll see that the beers that are produced by these regions are very much a reflection of, say, the hops or the malts that they can actually grow there. So this was back when we couldn't get ingredients from all over the world, and the food, the drink that we produced had to be a reflection of what we could get our hands on. So I said that you couldn't necessarily get hold of ingredients from all around the world and had to work with what you could get. But that's not strictly true. There was one way that these things were travelling kind of permanently in a way, and that was through immigration. So in the 1400s, Flemish farmers started to emigrate to the UK, and with them they brought the hop plants that they were growing in Belgium. It still has a small hop growing region in Poppringen. And they brought across their, I guess, Belgian varieties, or possibly more Central European varieties, and started growing them in the UK, where our soil and our goddamn miserable weather started to change the way that these hops tasted, the way that they smelt, the way that they grew. So there are lots of varieties that I could have picked to sniff here, but I've picked my absolute favourite, and also one with a really great story, which is Golding. So this is kind of the original British hop, I guess, to some extent. From it springs things like Fuggle and pretty much everything afterwards. So there are lots of different kinds of Goldings. There's Styrian Goldings, which are grown in Slovenia but are actually Fuggle grown in Slovenia. There's a bit of a misnomer there. East Kent Goldings come from East Kent. Goldings from elsewhere would just sort of say Goldings. And that's because historically, and I think in modern times, the Goldings of East Kent are the ones that are most recognised as being best. Now these hops Goldings would have been the ones that were used in the historical IPAs that we've talked a lot about on the channel, and essentially have resulted in the modern beer scene that we have today because they inspired the American IPAs that we all know and love. So this is the hop that would have gone into the beers, gone into the casks, and gone over to India in these long-aged, very, very hoppy beers. So the UK was actually the country that invented really heavy hopping rates, and they did so that the beers could survive uninfected on the way to India. Yeah, really, really lovely. It's got a kind of, I guess almost apricot-y kind of thing, like a slightly funky fruit to it, overripe fruit, but predominantly it's spice. It's almost kind of coriander-esque. It's kind of honeyed as well. We've got a lovely, lovely sweetness to it. And not a huge amount of that kind of cliche that we talk about with British hops, which is earthiness. You know, this is a very aromatic variety, and you can't use it in huge, huge quantities in the methods that we do today. But in the boil, you can, because it brings, you know, relatively little bitterness. These are at 5.8, so bigger than Hallertau, but still half that of the modern varieties from Germany. So you can load the boil with it, load the whirlpool with it, and get lovely, lovely honeyed, floral, sort of hedgerow, fleshy fruit kind of character from it. That I think would have been a really beautiful addition to these very dry, slightly kind of amber, pale IPAs that were going over to India. Now, of course, English IPAs now are kind of more of a curiosity. British beer, because of, say, the First World War and rationing and things that happened after that, have become very session-based. So these big, strong IPAs weren't that popular very quickly after sort of the East India Company closed. But we still use Goldings to really great effect in loads of absolutely brilliant British bitters, British pale ales, British porters. It's a really utilitarian hop. You can use it for lots and lots of different things and get a slightly different character out of it, depending on how much you use it, what style it goes into, and indeed which Goldings you're using from which farm. And in the UK, you don't really see this too often in modern brewing at all, but you will see in lots of British regional breweries, cask ale breweries, they'll know right down to the farm where these hops have come from, and they'll have been buying from those farmers for a long time. I saw that to best effect actually at Harvey's brewery down in Sussex, where Miles, the head brewer, even has them all separated in his hop store. So each farm has its own little area where he'll store their Goldings. Now, in response to the stuff we're about to talk about, these big, big, bold, aromatic hops that come from the New World, as we probably call it now in a sort of wine way, in response to that, British hops, much like with Mandarina Bavaria, have started to crossbreed varieties to create big, bold aromas as well. And we'll get into how that's done and the effect that it has on the hops and why it started when we come to America in a second. But this is a hop called Harlequin, which we used in our documentary The Time Is Now, about trying to revitalise the English or British IPA. And Harlequin is a cross where they were particularly looking for super ripe, citric, overripe tropical fruit kind of aromas to go into things like New England IPAs, West Coast IPAs, American pale ales, stuff like that. And as I cracked that bag, this is quite the sensory overload for me. I get licorice, and I get overripe mango, and I get a kind of creaminess, like yeah, sort of a lemon yogurt kind of thing coming out of it as well. A really lovely, sharp, overripe aroma, which you just wouldn't really expect from British hops. And these Harlequin hops are not grown in huge quantities yet, but British farmers really hope it's the future. You know, it might seem like a shame to try and sort of copy the Americans, but A, these will have their own terroir, their own flavour, but B, without these thriving, it's very unlikely that beautiful hops like Goldings will continue to thrive as well, because they're not very profitable hops to grow, they're not in huge demand. So we need the farmers who are closing at record rates in the UK to be able to diversify and grow all different kinds of hops. So if you ever see Harlequin growing, buy the beer. If you ever see, if you ever see Harlequin on a can, buy the beer. If you ever see Goldings on the can, or Fuggle, or Brambling Cross, or Admiral, whatever it is, buy those beers because they are under threat. So yeah, increasingly in the UK, we're starting to get these really modern aromas out of our hops. There's other varieties such as Olicana, Jester to some extent, although that's a lot more earthy than the newer varieties that are coming out, in my opinion. Godiva is brilliant as sort of lager hop, kind of like Hallertau Blanc kind of for the UK vibe. So there's loads and loads of different aromas coming out of British hops. They're not a one-trick pony. Lots of people just think about Fuggles and Golding, and even they aren't one-trick ponies, really. So yeah, all we could say about British hops really is there's a huge variety, modern and classic, and even within that there's lots of excitement to be had, but they will all have this kind of undercurrent of, I guess, sort of hedgerow or spice or something that is just that signature of British brewing. Even when it's in a New England IPA, there'll be something there, which I find really interesting. Not everybody would want that in their New England IPAs, but I think if you're going to use British hops, you're going to want that to be there.
That concludes the first episode of our global hop tour. Next week we're going to focus on the New World, specifically the Pacific Northwest of America and the increasingly popular New Zealand and Australian varieties. To be sure you get that notification, make sure you like and subscribe.
How much I miss not knowing that we're all screwed when we play our roles and ignore the problems. I wish I knew